everyone, how's it going? I wanted to do this video on the current state of horror movies because, well, things aren't looking too good at the moment. Now, before I get into this, let me give you a brief background on my love of horror so you know why I need to have a bit of a rant. The first horror movie I remember watching was Friday the 13th, when it first came out on VHS at the age of 7 or 8. For some reason, my dad let me watch it, and that ending where Jason jumps out of the water at the boat pretty much scarred me for life. But in a good way. I remember watching things like The Omen and Hell Night with Linda Blair, and developed quite a fascination with the feelings these films evoked. During the 80s, my love of horror kicked in full swing, and I've been hooked ever since, because both horror and comedy are my two favourite genres of film, mainly because to me they're the two that make you feel something the most. When you watch a good comedy film, aside from the laughter throughout, you feel uplifted afterwards, and with a good horror film, you get that feeling of fear, but it's a safe fear, like when you're on a roller coaster and you know that you're not going to fall off, but you still get scared anyway. Sure, there's something terrifying on the screen, but you're in a safe environment, either at home or a movie theater or in the arms of someone you love. A really good horror film will infect your mind and make you keep thinking about it for days after, but it's still all in good fun, since you're not really going to be killed or possessed or tormented by something from the afterlife. With the release of The Curse of the Weeping Woman, aka The Curse of La Llorona, Hollywood seems to have reached an all-time low in horror films. Now, I know we've been getting a whole ton of these sort of low-rate horror films for years, but that's my point. When is it going to end? Throughout the history of horror movies, there have been trends with each decade. The 70s produced some of the most acclaimed supernatural-themed horror films such as The Exorcist, The Omen, and Rosemary's Baby. At the time, these films were huge successes, largely because they provided audiences with something they hadn't seen before. Realistic depictions of demonic possession and the paranoia brought on by the satanic panic of the 60s were fresh to movie viewers, and therefore the horror movies of the 70s are widely considered among the greatest ever made. That decade also gradually gave birth to the slasher film, arguably starting with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but coming into its own with films such as Black Christmas and Halloween. The slasher genre became so popular that 80s horror films were almost defined by it. But for every 1,000 or so slumber party massacres, we were given cinematic treasures such as A Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and Child's Play. And despite some of these movies being far-fetched or even having an element of cheesiness, they still managed to scare us with imaginative villains and protagonists we actually gave a damn about. When Nancy stood up to Freddy by rigging her house with booby traps, we were totally on her side, and we cared about Karen Barclay protecting Andy from the murderous Chucky because of the mother and son bond. Hollywood figured out the formula to get us hooked, and boy did it work. While the 90s delivered some solid entries to the horror genre such as Silence of the Lambs, it also tried to continue the trend of slasher films until we became exhausted. The studios tried to reignite our interest by casting teen heartthrob actors in things such as I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, but by that point we had grown tired of the genre as it was offering nothing new. Scream was one exception as it turned the genre around and poked fun at itself, but that was why that film worked. It did something different. The 90s were also a time when horror remakes became a big thing. Starved for new ideas, Hollywood took a look back over its catalogue of horror films throughout the decades and produced new versions of old classics, such as The House on Haunted Hill and Night of the Living Dead, to varying degrees of acclaim. While a lot of these films didn't fare well with critics, they went on to have a cult following among a lot of fans, but not all of the 90s remakes were so well accepted. When Gus Van Sant remade Psycho, a shot-for-shot identical version to Hitchcock's classic, people really wondered what was the point of it all. Towards the end of the 90s, we reverted back to the supernatural. Movies such as Event Horizon, The Sixth Sense, and The Blair Witch Project presented unseen antagonists lurking in the dark or our minds. And while Asian horror had been around for many years, 1998's Ringu kick-started a worldwide appreciation for what Japan and other Asian countries were producing, to the point where Hollywood began to steal their flavour. Filmmakers in the 2000s went crazy with the found footage concept inspired by Blair Witch, so much that the subgenre almost became a parody of itself. There were some exceptions of films that were widely regarded as quality entries, such as Cloverfield and Wreck, but overall, audiences became exhausted by the amount of shaky cam films being produced. But that decade also saw a new level of creativity emerge. On one hand, we were given fun horror films such as Final Destination and Drag Me to Hell, but we also discovered that filmmakers were trying to come up with something new, something that could be the next big thing. House of the Devil was a great film that was made to appear like it was made in the 80s, and it did a superb job of it. But it also featured memorable characters and a solid story. It wasn't all about the gimmick. That decade also saw the rise of what's known as the new wave of French horror, where films such as High Tension, Martyrs, and Inside shocked us to the core. It was almost like French filmmakers were trying to grab the horror genre by the shoulders and shake some life back into it. Other filmmakers tried to do something similar with the so-called torture porn subgenre, with films such as Hostel and Saw designed to repulse audiences. At first, these films did indeed give us something a little new, but like the slasher films of the 80s, we soon grew tired of them. After a while, they weren't shocking anymore, and we saw the same old thing over and over again. Looking at the horror films of the 2000s, you can find quite a mixed bag of subgenres: home invasion films, supernatural films, zombie films, and quite a number of virus films. We also had some truly outstanding monster films such as The Descent, and the Asians kept churning out absolute gems, including what is, in my opinion, the scariest movie ever made, Shutter. Things were looking pretty good, but something happened within this past decade that has brought the horror genre to a standstill. There haven't been many memorable horror films outside of the supernatural/haunted house category. Sure, there have been a few such as Goodnight Mummy, You're Next, and Cabin in the Woods that were quite creative and even a little fun. But when you think about the most acclaimed and most popular horror movies of the past 9 years, no doubt you think of films like Hereditary, The Babadook, The Conjuring, and Insidious, the last two becoming so popular they've spawned franchises. And just like the slasher films of the 80s, Hollywood has once again fallen into the trap of laziness and complacency, churning out some of the worst horror films we've seen in many years. Wouldn't it have been great if The Conjuring had just been left alone as a singular film? Sure, its sequel was pretty good, and Annabelle Creation was a solid film too, but half of the Conjuring franchise has been critically panned and widely dismissed by audiences. When I saw The Curse of the Weeping Woman a few days back, there were two guys who left halfway through the film, and I really wish I'd joined them. We've been subjected to a barrage of trash such as Slender Man, Ouija, and The Bye Bye Man. It seems Hollywood are rushing to add more films to this list, but why? Or more importantly, what is it that makes these films so awful to watch? In the last few years, there have been a few horror movies that were, in my opinion, pretty good. Lights Out was one, and also Don't Breathe. Ouija Origin of Evil and Annabelle Creation were also solid films, but when I think about these few movies, I don't focus on how scary they were or how many jump scares happened every few minutes. The first thing that comes to mind with these films is the characters and stories. Lights Out had a really interesting and tragic family dynamic which invested us in the people in the story. Don't Breathe's main characters, while not model citizens, also had tragic pasts and you couldn't help but feel sympathy for them. Ouija Origin of Evil and Annabelle Creation not only featured the family dynamic, but decent writing and performances, almost like the filmmakers actually cared about crafting an interesting story. And that's what's missing from so many of the junk horror films being churned out in mass, mainly characters we care about. Take Slender Man for instance. I couldn't tell you the name of a single character in that film or what sort of person they were. They were utterly forgettable. Same with Weeping Woman. As much as it tried to tap into that family element, it didn't try hard enough. We didn't really care who the people were thanks to unimaginative dialogue and poor character choices. So who cares if the evil thing kills them all or takes their kids away or pees in their soup? If we're not 100% behind the characters, then the evil thing is just there to go boo, and that's not enough. We're almost at the end of another decade, so hopefully things will change soon. I'm really hoping Hollywood wakes up to the fact that we're tired of these so-called horror films that are produced to make a quick buck and gives us more quality stuff like Hereditary. While it's difficult to categorize his films as horror, especially his first, it seems that Jordan Peele could be the surprise savior of the genre. Having done two highly acclaimed features now with Get Out and Us, surely studios have paid enough attention to realize that those are the kind of films we want. Sure, they're not perfect, but I'd sooner take something like Us over 100 Truth or Dares. I'm really hoping that movies like these and the way Jordan Peele is crafting his films is going to be a much needed wake-up call to Hollywood, and maybe we can move on from this rut we seem to be stuck in, because right now things need to change. If we can't find new ways to tell stories or fresh ideas like we had in the 70s, at least let's hope for stories with characters we care enough about to feel scared for them. If history is anything to go by, with any luck, that change won't be too far away. So that's my thoughts on the current state of horror films. Yeah, if you guys agree with me, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to add to it, by all means, drop me some comments. Let's get a discussion happening, because yeah, I don't know, it's just something that really means a lot to me, because like I said, I really do love horror films immensely, and I'm really tired of the way things are at the moment. So yeah, if you've got any thoughts you'd like to add to it, drop me some comments either here, Facebook or Twitter. All the social media links are in the description below, because I like to talk about movies and I would love to talk about movies with you. Catch you next time.
Click subscribe to stay up to date with all the latest movie reviews. Skynet will be taking over any day now, so what have you got to lose? Nyah.